let's get into it. Joan of Arc. Let's see. She was born around 1412. Died on May 30th, 1431. She called herself Joan the Maiden and is now nicknamed the Maid of Orleans. Um, is considered a heroine of France for her role during the Lancastrian phase of the Hundred Years' War. She is also a saint in the Roman Catholic Church. Joan was born to Jacques. Alright, I'm gonna obliterate these names and I apologize. Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romy, a peasant family at Domremy in the Vosges of northeast France. In 1428, Joan, who was about 17 years old, traveled to Vaucouleurs and requested an armed escort to bring her to King Charles the VII. Joan later testified that she had received visions from the Archangel Michael. I don't know why I'm doing this, but I could speak privately. Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine, instructing her to support Charles VII and recover France from English domination. Man, so that's like, because I always put things into context of the Vikings. The Vikings were like the 800s, 900s, a little bit over the thousands. But then you start getting into the medieval time period, and that's like the 1200s and the 1300s and the 1400s where she lived. So, let's see. So her request to see the king was rejected twice, but eventually the garrison commander Robert de Baudricourt relented and gave her an escort to meet Charles at Chinon. After their interview, Charles sent Joan to the siege of Orleans as part of a relief army. She arrived at the city on the 29th of April, 1429, and quickly gained prominence for her role in lifting the siege 9 days after she arrived in Orleans. During the following June, Joan played a key role in the Loire campaign, which culminated in the decisive defeat of the English at the Battle of Patay. After the battle, the French army advanced on Reims and entered the city on the 16th of July. The next day, Charles was consecrated as the King of France in Reims Cathedral with Joan at his side. These victories boosted French morale and paved the way for the final French victory in the 100 Years' War at Castilian in 1453. Incredible. So there's a lot to her. Early life. Oh, there's a picture. Because it says Joan's birthplace in Domremy is now a museum. The village church where she attended mass is to the right behind the tree. So her house was like right by the museum. I mean, by the church. So according to Wikipedia, during Joan's youth, Domremy was a border village in eastern France whose precise feudal relation was unclear. Much of it lay in a section of the Duchy of Bar, which owed fealty to France. Although the region was surrounded by pro-Burgundian lands, the loyalty of its people lay with the French crown. By 1419, the war had begun to affect the area. In 1425, the village cattle were stolen by an unaligned brigand named Henry d'Orly. In 1428, the region was raided by a Burgundian army under Antoine de Vergy. who set fire to the town and destroyed its crops. It was during this period that Joan had her first vision. Joan testified that when she was 13, around 1425, a figure she identified as Saint Michael, surrounded by angels, appeared to her in her father's garden. After the vision, she reported weeping because she wanted him to take her with them. Throughout her life, she continued to have visions of Saint Michael as well as Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret. In 1428, a young man from her village took her to court on the allegation that she had broken a promise of marriage, which was brought before the local bishop in the city of Toul. The bishop dismissed the suit after ruling in her favor. The English began their siege at Orleans in 1428. It was one of the few remaining cities still loyal to Charles VII, and an important objective since it held a strategic position along the Loire River, which made it the last obstacle to an assault on the remainder of Charles VII's territory. The fate of Orleans was critical to the survival of the French kingdom. And by the end of the year, it was completely surrounded. At this time, Joan stated that her visions had told her that she must leave Domremy and go to France. That is the core of the kingdom still controlled by Charles' faction to help the Dauphin. Around May 1428, Joan asked a relative named Durand Laxart to take her to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs, where she petitioned the garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt, for an armed escort to take her to the French royal court at Chinon. Baudricourt's sarcastic response did not deter her. She returned the following January, requested an audience, and was once more refused. In the meantime, she gained support from two of Baudricourt's soldiers, John de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy. In February, around the time the French were defeated at the Battle of the Herrings, when they tried to intercept a convoy providing supplies to English troops for the siege of Orleans. Metz and Poulengy were able to obtain for Joan a third interview with Baudricourt. Their enthusiastic support for her, as well as her personal conversations with him, convinced Baudricourt to give her permission to travel for an audience with the Dauphin. Joan traveled to Chinon with a small escort of 6 soldiers. Before heading out, Metz asked her if she was going to travel through hostile Burgundian territory in her dress, but she agreed to switch to a soldier's outfit, which her escort viewed as a necessary expedient. Her escorts and the people of Vaucouleurs provided her with the clothing. Around this time, she adopted the designation Joan the Maiden, or Virgin, based on the vow of virginity which she had taken. After Charles' consecration, that's a big deal. After Charles's consecration, Joan and John II, Duke of Alencon's army besieged Paris. An assault on the city was launched on 8th of September. It failed, and Joan was wounded by an arrow. The French forces withdrew, and Charles disbanded the army. By October, Joan had recovered and participated in an attack on the territory of Perronet Grissart, a mercenary who had been in the service of the English and Burgundian faction, a group of French nobles allied with the English. After some initial successes, the campaign ended in a failed attempt to take Grissart's stronghold at La Charité-sur-Loire. By December, Joan was back at the French court, where she learned that she and her family had been ennobled by Charles VII. In May 1430, Joan organized a company of volunteers to relieve Compiègne, which had been besieged by the Burgundians. Which I guess it says later that the Burgundians... So there was like two sides, as there usually is in war. Like in the American Revolution, you had the loyalists who were with Britain, and then you had the patriots who wanted, freedom. With this one, you have the loyalists of France, where they call them something. But then you have the ones who are in France but want to be a part of Britain. They're called the Burgundians. So she organized a company of volunteers, but she was captured by Burgundian troops on the 23rd of May and afterwards exchanged to the English. She was put on trial by the pro-English bishop Pierre Cachon on the charge of heresy. So basically, the English paid this fool. That's what I'm guessing. She was declared guilty and burned at the stake on the 30th of May, 1431, dying at about 19 years of age. In 1456, which is like 20-something years later, an inquisitorial court authorized by Pope Calixtus III investigated the original trial, which was found to have been by deceit, fraud, and incorrect procedure. I still have heartburn. The verdict of Joan's original trial was nullified and the stain on Joan's name declared to be erased. Joan has been popularly revered as a martyr since her death. And after the French Revolution, she became a symbol of France. She was beatified in 1909, canonized in 1920, and declared a secondary patron saint of France in 1922. Joan of Arc had remained a popular figure in literature, painting, sculpture, and other cultural works since the time of her death. And many famous writers, playwrights, filmmakers, artists, and composers have created and continue to create cultural depictions of her. She was born during the 100-Year War. At the time of, so this is what, so the 100 Years' War was a conflict between the kingdoms of England and France that had begun in 1337. The cause of the war was an inheritance dispute over the French throne. Nearly all the fighting had taken place in France, and its economy was devastated. At the time of Joan's birth, France was divided. I mean, it could totally be possible that God didn't want Britain to take France, because then they would have been a little too powerful. Let's see. At the time of Joan's birth, France was divided. The French King Charles VI had suffered from bouts of mental illness and was often unable to rule. The king's brother Louis, Duke of Orleans, and the king's cousin John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, quarreled over the regions of France. Well, I mean, it should have been the brother, right? I mean, even though cousin John the Fearless thinks he should be, it's got to be the king's brother, I would assume. The conflict climaxed with the assassination of the Duke of Orleans, the brother, in 1407 on the orders of the Duke of Burgundy, his cousin. This assassination began a civil war. Damn. So even though France was fighting England, there became an internal war. Supporters of Charles of Orleans, who succeeded his father as Duke and placed in the custody of his father-in-law, Count of Armagnac, became known as Armagnacs. Supporters of the Duke of Burgundy became known as Burgundians. Just before Joan joined the conflict in 1429, the English had nearly achieved their goal of an Anglo-French dual monarchy. Henry V's brothers, John of Lancaster, 1st Duke of Bedford, and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, had continued the English conquest of France. Nearly all of northern France, Paris, and parts of the southern France were under Anglo-Burgundian control. The Burgundians also controlled Reims, which had served as the traditional site for the coronation of French kings. This was important, as Charles had not been yet anointed as king, and doing so at Reims would help legitimize his claim to the throne. During this time, there were two prophecies circulating around the French countryside. One promised that a maid from the borderlands of Lorraine would come forth to work miracles, and the other was that France had been lost by a woman, but would be restored by a virgin. I don't know how France would have been lost by a woman. Let's see. So Joan's first meeting with Charles VII took place at a royal court in the town of Chinon. Like we said, she was 17, he was 26. Charles had hidden himself from the crowd among members of the court, but Joan quickly identified and approached him. Joan told him that she had come to raise the siege of Orleans and to lead him to Reims for his coronation. They had also a private exchange that made a strong impression on Charles, but Charles and his council needed more assurance. They sent her to Poitiers to be examined by a council of theologians to verify her morality and ensure her orthodoxy. The council declared her a good Catholic and a good person. The theologians at Poitiers did not render a decision on the source of Joan's inspiration, but agreed that sending her to Orleans could be useful to the king and would test her if her inspiration was of divine origin. Afterwards, she was sent on to Tours, where she was physically examined by women directed by Charles's mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon, who verified her virginity. After her examinations, this Dauphin commissioned plate armor for her. She received a banner of her own design and had a sword brought for her from underneath the altar in the church of Saint Catherine de Fierbois. Joan effectively turned the long-standing Anglo-French conflict into a religious war. While at the Poitiers, for example, Joan had dictated a letter to the Duke of Bedford that began Jesus Mary, and then warned Bedford that she was sent by God to drive him out of France. Before Joan's arrival, the French strategic situation was bad but not hopeless. The French forces in Orleans were prepared to survive a prolonged siege. The Burgundians had recently withdrawn from participating in the siege due to disagreements about territory. And the English felt unsure about continuing it, but the French leadership had a loser's mentality. I don't know why they said that. The French court's acceptance of Joan's role may have been taken out of desperation, but her effect on morale was immediate. Even before she joined the army, her presence created devotion and the hope of divine assistance. And even news of her coming may have encouraged the people of Orleans to continue their resistance. When Joan and the forces were set off to Orleans, she was initially treated as a figurehead to raise morale. Throughout her military career, Joan would fulfill this role. She said she carried her banner on the battlefield rather than fighting, and had never killed anyone. She gained the faith of the Armagnac troops, who believed she was capable of bringing them to victory. Though the army was commanded by noblemen, eventually many of them often accepted the advice she gave them, particularly her emphasis on rapid offensive action. Some of the commanders said that she had an uncanny ability for performing tasks such as assembling the army and arranging the disposition of troops and artillery. So there's so much more of my stuff there. At Chinon, Joan had declared that she was sent by God, so she was not humble about it, which is pretty interesting, but that's cool. The sudden victory at Orleans so they had a victory at Orleans, opened up a number of strategic possibilities, and many Armagnac leaders favored an invasion of Normandy, which was from the Northmen, which was from Rollo, which if you watch Vikings, Rollo was the brother of Ragnar Lothbrok on that show. But Joan advocated that the Armagnac forces should advance without delay towards Reims so the Dauphin could be crowned. Charles was persuaded and allowed her to accompany the army, which is under the commands of troops led by John II, Duke of Alencon. Alencon would collaboratively work with Joan, regularly heeding her advice. Before they could advance towards Reims, Joan and Alencon were first required to clear the way between Chinon and Orleans by capturing the bridge towns along the Loire, Jargeau, Mont-sur-Loire, and Beaugency. Interesting. So yeah, she was put on trial for heresy. Later on, they brought up the trial again. So according to this, in her trial, Joan showed remarkable control. Some of her requests, such as having her fetters removed, allowing a more balanced tribunal by adding clerics from the pro-Armagnac side, and her appeal to the Pope, were denied by the judge. She was able to induce her interrogators to ask questions sequentially rather than simultaneously, refer back to the records when appropriate, and end the sessions when she requested. Yeah. They were going to torture her, but they voted against it. They said she was guilty of heresy. She signed a document, but she didn't understand what it said because she was illiterate. And most of it was written in Latin. Let's see. Let's see. So she was 19 when they executed her. So, Joan's execution did not help the English in the long run, as they never regained their previous momentum after 1429. This was a turning point in the 100 Years' War, marking a permanent decline in English fortunes. Charles VII retained legitimacy as the King of France, despite a rival coronation held for the 10-year-old Henry VI of England at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris on the 16th of December, 1431. In 1435, the Burgundians agreed to abandon their alliance with England by signing the Treaty of Arras, 1 week after the death of the English regent, the Duke of Bedford. The war did not end until after the Battle of Castillon in 1453, 22 years after Joan's execution, when the English were removed from all of France except for Calais. So Joan's execution had created a political liability for Charles, as it implied that his consecration as the King of France had been achieved through the actions of a heretic. So in 1450, they opened an inquest. They interviewed 7 witnesses of Joan's trial, and concluding that the judgment of Joan as a heretic was arbitrary. She had been a prisoner of war, treated as a political prisoner, and was put to death without basis. Bouilly's report could not officially overturn the verdict, but it opened the way for the later retrial. So in 1452, a cardinal opened up a new trial, and basically they ended up making her a saint. They put a cross where she died. They interviewed like 115 witnesses. I mean, they did their due diligence for this woman. Now, some haters will say it's fake. The standard accounts of Joan's life have been challenged by revisionist authors. Claims include that Joan of Arc was not actually burned at the stake, that she was secretly the half-sister of King Charles VII, and that it was a member of a pagan cult, and that most of her story was a myth. Yo, haters gonna hate. But the truth is, French were the underdogs. Because of Joan of Arc, they won.